Because of my unusual line of work, I spend the majority of my days traveling and encountering new faces. Most of these meetings are fleeting and forgotten, but occasionally, someone will sense they can confide in me. A story that weighs on them, one they cannot share with anyone else, or a memory they're desperate to forget. Over time, I've collected these tales during my travels. I'm not sure what it is about me that encourages people to trust me with their secrets. Perhaps they sense that, no matter how bizarre their experiences, I will listen without judgment. Just a few days ago, I accidentally collided with a woman as she exited a small convenience store. Her drink fell to the ground, and when I picked it up to hand it back, she stared at me. In that instant, I could tell she saw me as someone she could unburden herself to, someone who would listen to the story troubling her. Unfortunately, I didn't have the time to stop and listen right then. I was in a rush, which was the very reason I bumped into her in the first place. Still, I gave her my business card and told her to call me later that evening or the next day. I don't usually hand out my number to people with stories rather than work to offer, but I made an exception for her. Later that night, she called me, and I finally had the time to listen to what had been troubling her for over a year. She permitted me to write down her story, though I changed the names and kept the details about locations vague for her privacy. I tried to stay as true to her words as possible, though I only started recording them after the fact so that some phrases might differ slightly. It seemed to comfort her that someone believed her account, but whether or not you think it is up to you. I'm simply sharing the story as it was told to me. That night, she began her tale. Over a year ago, I got engaged to my high school sweetheart. He was the only person I'd ever dated, and I was blind to the small warning signs that began surfacing in our relationship. They weren't glaring red flags, just things that were easy to overlook or dismiss because I believed that love would solve everything. Lucas would occasionally stay out all night, and I assumed he was picking up extra hours at work or crashing at a friend's place. He spent too much on alcohol most weekends and often ordered takeout, even though we were barely scraping by to cover rent. When he proposed, he bought the cheapest ring he could find, which didn't bother me. But his mother later asked what had happened to his late grandmother's ring, the one he inherited. He claimed he kept it locked in a safe because it was too valuable to risk losing. I didn't question him on this, especially since I had a reputation for losing small things like earrings or keys. I even agreed that keeping the ring safe was a good idea. It could be something to pass down to our future children, though Lucas always seemed uncomfortable whenever I brought up the subject of kids. He would quickly change the topic and I would drop it. Planning a wedding is stressful enough, as anyone will tell you. Lucas disliked many of my friends and didn't want them at the wedding. Meanwhile, I didn't care for some of his friends, especially after hearing rumors that they were dealing drugs at their parties. I didn't want any of them near our wedding, let alone risk the embarrassment of the police showing up because his friends decided to conduct shady deals during the reception. Our disagreements began with minor wedding details but soon extended to nearly every aspect of our lives. To avoid constant arguments, I started giving in to his preferences. The last day I spent with Lucas was when we visited his uncle's apple orchard, where we planned to hold the reception. It was a stunning location and very affordable since it was family-owned, though it was a bit far from the city. We might get through the day without fighting, but I was wrong. On the drive back, we argued again about the guest list. It escalated into the worst fight we'd ever had. For the first time, I raised my voice, pleading with him to understand my concerns about his friends. The argument spiraled, bringing up every unresolved issue between us. On that dark, empty highway, surrounded by trees, Lucas unleashed every cruel thought he'd kept bottled up. He blamed me for everything wrong in our relationship, for pressing him about having children, for letting myself go since high school, for burdening him with responsibilities. His words cut deeper than I could have imagined, especially since I was working 2 part-time jobs to support us while struggling to find better opportunities. His tirade left me sobbing uncontrollably. Then, something happened that I never expected. While driving, he struck me with his free hand so hard that my head hit the window. The shock and pain stopped my crying, but as I processed what had happened, the urge to weep again rose within me. I forced it down, terrified he might hit me a second time. I whispered, "We shouldn't be together." He heard me, but he didn't respond. The expression on his face was a calm yet chilling anger. I still get shivers thinking about it, certain that, at that moment, he wanted to kill me. My body trembled as I kept my eyes on him. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A deer standing in the road ahead, illuminated by the headlights. Lucas had enough time to steer into the other lane to avoid it, and for a moment it looked like we might be lucky enough to miss it. The deer darted to the left, but Lucas deliberately swerved to hit the poor deer. My head slammed against the dashboard, and for a moment, everything went black as stars danced in my vision. The deer collided with our car, its body rolling over the hood, cracking the windshield, and leaving a dent in the front. Miraculously, the airbags didn't deploy. Lucas cursed loudly as he skidded the car to a stop on the side of the road. We sat there, both breathing heavily, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. He had tried to kill both of us, though neither of us would say it aloud. Once I regained my senses, I stumbled out of the car. I don't know if I was trying to escape Lucas or check on the deer. Blood dripped from a wound on my forehead, but I paid it no attention. The deer lay in the middle of the road, its body twisted and broken, yet it was still alive, twitching in pain. I limped over, my pain from the seatbelt digging into my torso, paling in comparison to the creature's suffering. Kneeling beside it, I stroked its head softly, murmuring an apology it couldn't understand. Its eyes were wide and terrified, its ears flicking slightly, but its neck was clearly broken, rendering it unable to move. I couldn't shake the guilt. If I hadn't agreed to marry Lucas, we wouldn't have been on that road, and this innocent creature would have been safe. Lucas approached, his voice filled with fury as he hurled threats, demanding I get back in the car. I stayed where I was, ignoring him. Couldn't abandon the deer. It felt like the least I could do was be there while it took its final breaths. Tears blurred my vision as I watched Lucas draw closer, his figure illuminated by the crimson glow of the car's taillights. My only hope was that another car might pass and intervene, but the road remained empty. Then, a breeze swept through the forest surrounding us, rustling the trees on the opposite side of the road. At first, I thought the movement and sounds were just the wind, but something about the noise, a rhythmic creaking, like branches colliding, felt off. Looking up, I froze. Rising above the treetops were massive antlers, far too large to belong to any ordinary animal. As the rest of the figure came into view, its head emerged, a silhouette against the moonlight, unmistakably that of a deer. But no deer could ever be this enormous, its head towering above the forest. Even Lucas stopped, his anger momentarily replaced by shock. The creature's eyes opened, and I realized they were not like any eyes I'd ever seen. Countless orbs of silver light glimmered across its entire head, varying in size and shape, but all radiating the glow of moonlight. The sheer impossibility of the sight should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange awe. The creature lifted its head further, emitting a groaning sound that reverberated through the night air. Then, it released a bellow so loud and deep that it seemed to shake my very soul. My bones ached under the weight of the sound, and my ears felt like they might burst. I wasn't religious, but at that moment, I thought I understood what the end of the world might sound like. Lucas collapsed to his knees, clutching his ears, trying in vain to block out the deafening noise. Even after it stopped, we were both stunned, unable to move or speak. Then new eyes appeared, lower to the ground this time, surrounding us. Deer began to emerge from the forest into the moonlight. But these were no ordinary deer. Their eyes glowed a milky white, and their bodies were twisted, decayed, and broken. Some dragged shattered limbs behind them, while others shuffled with jerky, unnatural movements. The stench of rot was overwhelming. Lucas, trembling, managed to get to his feet. He stumbled toward the car, abandoning me. He barely made it a few steps before a female deer darted out and rammed him, sending him sprawling back toward me. Panic consumed him as he tried to get up, only for a buck to charge, grazing him with its antlers and tearing his shirt. The undead deer began to close in, shoving him from one to another with painful force. A sharp kick from a hoof finally brought him down, breaking his jaw and knocking his teeth loose. Blood poured from his mouth as he screamed in agony, the sound echoing in the still night. The massive deer from the forest remained motionless, watching the horrific scene unfold. I couldn't bring myself to intervene. At one time I had loved Lucas, but at that moment I felt nothing. His pleas for help, garbled and bloody, meant nothing to me. He tried to crawl away, leaving a crimson trail on the asphalt, but the deer allowed no escape. One stomped on his legs, shattering the bones and trapping him. Then the deer we had hit, its neck grotesquely twisted, rose to its feet. Despite its injuries, it stumbled forward, its steps slow and deliberate, heading straight for Lucas. By the time it reached him, he had managed to crawl to the edge of the road, barely clinging to life. The deer stood over him, their gazes locked. Lucas babbled incoherent apologies, spitting blood with every word. But the deer didn't care. It reared up on its hind legs and, with a final, devastating blow, brought its hooves down onto his face. I wanted to look away, but I didn't. I had loved Lucas once, and though he had become a monster, I felt I owed it to him to witness his end. I watched in stunned silence as the deer, with its grotesquely broken neck, continued to batter Lucas. Its front legs rose and fell repeatedly, each impact cracking his skull further. I could hear the wet, sickening sound of bone shattering and his attempts to scream, which were abruptly silenced when his head became an unrecognizable mess. Finally, the deer stopped. My heart raced, expecting I would be next, but the creatures turned and began retreating into the forest, dragging their decayed bodies back into the shadows. Before I could fully process what had happened, the bone-rattling trumpet sound emanated again from the colossal figure still looming over the trees. The pressure and intensity overwhelmed me, and I blacked out. When I regained consciousness, I was in the back of an ambulance. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burnt metal and plastic, and flashing lights danced across my vision. A man I didn't recognize assured me I was safe and told me to rest. Exhausted, I drifted back to unconsciousness. When I woke again, I was in a hospital bed. The police explained what they believed had happened. Lucas and I fought, and he had left me on the roadside before speeding off. A truck driver passing by witnessed me being thrown from the car with a bloodied head and pulled over to help. He claimed that moments later, a deer ran out in front of Lucas's car, causing it to crash and catch fire. Strangely, the deer's body was never recovered. The authorities chalked it up to shock on my part and accepted the truck driver's account. I nodded in agreement, though I had no memory of those events. Deep down, I couldn't dismiss the vivid images of what I had seen. They felt too real to be a nightmare. The truck driver disappeared after giving his statement. It turned out he had provided a false name, so I was never able to thank him. The unsettling part was how Lucas's body was found. Some parts were completely incinerated, while others were untouched, a phenomenon no one could explain. Despite this oddity, the case was closed, and I tried to accept it as a stress-induced hallucination. After returning home from the hospital, I had a dream. In it, I was surrounded by the undead deer, their lifeless eyes fixed on me. I wept for them, overwhelmed by guilt. When I woke up, there was something at the foot of my bed that hadn't been there before. A single antler. I didn't know if it was a warning or a gesture of gratitude, but I decided to keep it. Later, I asked whoever encounters those creatures might not be as fortunate. So, take heed of deer crossing signs, drive carefully at night, and if you ever hit a deer, I hope it forgives you. That was the story the woman shared with me. I thanked her for trusting me with it. I doubt she will ever call me again, but perhaps sharing her tale brought her some relief. I may return with more stories in the future. Recently, I've been hearing rumors about someone people call a half-blood cryptic. Though my unusual job keeps me busy, if time allows, I'll document more of the strange events I've come across. About a year ago, I unexpectedly finished a job earlier than planned and found myself stranded in an unfamiliar city late at night. With nowhere else to go, I managed to find a small motel that was open 24 hours. It was run down and I worried about how clean the rooms would be, but it was better than sleeping on the street. I entered the dimly lit office to check in, but it was empty. I guess the clerk was napping, not expecting customers at that hour. While waiting, I browsed the counter, flipping through a stack of old magazines. I wasn't particularly tired and didn't care for most TV shows, so reading was my usual way to pass the time. My small collection of paperbacks had already been read, so I was eager for something new. Among the worn magazines was a thin notebook, the kind students use for schoolwork. Curious, I began flipping through its pages just as the clerk appeared to check me in. After securing my room, I asked about the notebook. The clerk explained it had been left behind by a guest a few days earlier. They didn't know who had stayed in the room, only that the journal was found abandoned, with the room door left wide open and the bed pushed against the far wall. Assuming the guest might return for it, they kept the notebook, but no one came back. The clerk planned to throw it out, but I offered to take it along with the magazines. Once settled in my room, I examined the notebook again. It was plain and inexpensive, with the first few pages torn out. The remaining pages were filled with neat handwriting, detailing a story most would dismiss as fiction. Having encountered strange things myself, I wasn't so quick to judge. Later, I gave the journal to a friend who collects unusual items. I remember that journal now because I recently heard about someone mentioned in its pages. Since I have the time, I should document what I recall. Though it's been a year, the events remain clear in my mind. The words may not be exact, but the essence of the story is intact. This incident happened when I was still in school. It's an event my town hasn't forgotten, though no one but me knows the truth of what occurred. Well, no other human, at least. I was in my final year, eagerly counting down the days until graduation. Like many of my peers, I longed to leave our sleepy little town behind and start my adult life. My two closest friends shared the same dream. Though we had different plans for the future, we promised to stay in touch after graduation. To celebrate our impending freedom, we planned a camping trip over one of the last long weekends before adulthood beckoned. The trip had been in the works for months. We saved up, stashed away supplies, and even smuggled some alcohol for the occasion. It was meant to be our final adventure before parting ways. The first hiccup in our plan came when Ethan started dating Laura. She was the type of person who couldn't let conversations pause for even a moment, always needing to fill the silence. Though I found her exhausting to be around, I couldn't deny how happy Ethan was with her. I didn't dislike Laura or think she was a bad person. I just preferred limited time in her company. I never mentioned this to Ethan, but I think he knew. Somehow, Laura learned about our camping trip and invited herself along. It was frustrating, but I wasn't going to let her ruin our plans. I resolved to find a way to tolerate her presence. Then, there was Dylan, our easygoing prankster, who managed to sprain his arm just days before the trip. He was one of those lucky types who seemed immune to serious injury, so this was a first for him. His overprotective mom almost kept him from coming, but Dylan was determined. I wish he'd listened to her. We were young and convinced of our invincibility. When the day finally came, I was packing my things when the phone rang. My parents answered, and within minutes they were scrambling. My aunt, who lived out of state, had fallen critically ill during treatment. My parents needed to leave immediately to see her. I offered to go with them, but they insisted I go on the trip. After all, I had been looking forward to it for so long. The real issue was my younger brother, Max. He was 13 and had an uncanny ability to get himself into accidents. Unlike Dylan, he seemed to attract bad luck. While he could technically stay home alone for a night or two, the risk wasn't worth it. None of the usual people who could watch him were available on such short notice, so the only option was to bring him along. Bringing my little brother on a camping trip was less than ideal, but I didn't have a choice. It also meant I couldn't indulge as much as I'd planned. My dad handed me his old flip phone in case Max got hurt or something went wrong. I shoved it into my jacket pocket without much thought. Since my parents needed the car, we had to walk to the meeting spot. It wasn't far, about an hour's hike, but Max slowed us down, and we arrived just as the sun was setting. Dylan greeted us at the edge of the woods, giving me a hard time about bringing Max. Still, I think he preferred my brother's company over Laura's. Because I was late, the others had already set up their tents. Max and I scrambled to pitch ours in the fading light. Despite the rocky start, I found the atmosphere surprisingly peaceful. Laura sat quietly on a log near the fire Ethan had started. She looked pale and uncharacteristically silent, which worried me. Laura was never one to stop talking. "Check out these weird flyers we found," Ethan said before I could ask about Laura. He handed me a few sheets of paper. I had noticed some posted on trees as Max and I walked through the woods, but I hadn't stopped to read them. Apparently, the group had found a bunch and used them to start the fire. Lost in the woods? Call this number. Need help? Call it. Seeing strange things? You guessed it. Call this number. Each flyer had the same number printed at the bottom. Ethan tossed the remaining papers into the fire before I could memorize the number. Back then, cell phones weren't as common, and I'd forgotten about the one in my pocket. If I'd remembered, we probably would have tried calling the number to see what would happen. Instead, the papers burned away. "Hey, Max, why don't you gather more of those papers? And grab some wood while you're at it," Ethan suggested. Thrilled to be given an important task by an older kid, Max eagerly ran off with a flashlight, staying within sight of the group as he collected twigs and scraps of paper. Finally, I had a chance to ask, "Are you okay, Laura?" She was still sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. Max darted back and forth from the edge of the woods, adding his finds to the pile while the rest of us chatted about school. Laura remained mostly silent, nodding occasionally but contributing little to the conversation. "I'm fine," she said softly, not looking at me. "She doesn't have a fever. Probably just tired," Ethan said, wrapping an arm around her. "Just tired," Laura echoed, though something about her tone felt off. "Maybe we should take her back," I suggested, standing up. It was already dark, but with a flashlight, I could follow the trail out of the woods. I didn't want them to think I was trying to get rid of her, but I was genuinely worried. "No," Laura snapped, her head jerking up. The glare she gave me froze me in place. For a moment, her expression was unnervingly dark. Then, as if realizing how strange she was acting, she forced a strained smile. "Just tired," she repeated, sounding more like her usual self. Dylan, sensing the tension, quickly changed the mood by bringing out marshmallows. Max appeared out of nowhere, drawn by the promise of snacks, and soon, Laura's odd behavior was forgotten. The rest of the evening went smoothly. We roasted marshmallows, made s'mores, and dared each other to eat them while they were still on fire. Our original plan was to drink, but we only had one beer. Max tried a sip, gagged, and hopefully swore off alcohol until he was older. Despite the minor setbacks, we had a great time. We spent hours sharing silly stories, laughing, and talking about our plans for the future. When Laura decided to call it a night, I figured it was a good idea for everyone to get some rest. I settled Max into our tent and stayed outside to help Ethan chop some firewood. Dylan, nursing his injured arm, retreated to his small tent beside mine, leaving Ethan and me to handle the task. We knew if we didn't do it that night, we'd be too tired or lazy to bother in the morning. Ethan had brought a small hand axe, which made the job easier. In no time, we had a decent pile of wood. Max had done a good job collecting small branches earlier, but we needed larger pieces to keep the fire going. I can't remember my last words to Ethan. Most nights, I lie awake, trying to recall if I said anything to him before he went into his tent, but the memory escapes me. As final moments with a friend go, I'd say I had a good one. Inside the tent, Max and I shared the space, which was cramped. I managed to sleep for about an hour before Max stirred and woke me up. He crawled over me, fumbling for the flashlight. "What are you doing?" I whispered, trying not to wake the others. "I need to pee," Max whispered back. I groaned. I didn't need to go, but I couldn't let Max wander into the woods alone. A ridiculous image of a giant owl swooping down and carrying him away crossed my mind, and I snorted quietly. Knowing Max's luck, something absurd like that could happen. "I'll come with you," I said, grabbing my jacket. Stretching as I stepped outside, I waited for Max to start walking. The fire was still flickering faintly. Max tested the flashlight, sweeping its beam through the trees. In the distance, I caught a glimpse of something white. At first, I thought it was another one of those strange flyers stuck to a tree. I stared at the shape, trying to make it out, but my attention shifted when Ethan's tent opened. As I turned back toward the woods, I realized the white shape had moved. I'd been so sure it was just paper fluttering in the breeze, but then another white figure emerged from behind a tree, and then another. Next to me, Max screamed. Reflexively, I grabbed him and looked toward Ethan's tent to see what had startled him. Laura was standing barefoot outside, staring at us. "Just tired," she said in a strained, unfamiliar voice. Blood drenched her front, dripping onto the ground. Her face was still hers, but her body looked unnaturally thin and pale. Her fingers were grotesquely long and twisted as she stepped closer, stumbling slightly. "No, just tired." Everything erupted into chaos. Dylan burst out of his tent, alarmed by Max's scream, only to freeze at the sight of Laura. Before he could react, a pale blur shot out of the woods, tackling him to the ground. I darted toward the fire pit to grab the axe, letting go of Max in the process. My little brother panicked and screamed, bolting into the woods with the flashlight. I was faced with an awful choice, one I regret to this day. A creature impossibly thin and pale was on top of Dylan, snapping its teeth as it tried to bite his face. More pale figures emerged from the trees. Axe in hand, I rushed to Dylan and yanked the creature off him. With all my strength, I swung the axe into its neck. It let out a hideous shriek, and Dylan looked at me with a mixture of shock and gratitude. But I didn't stay to help him. I turned and ran after Max, leaving Dylan behind. To this day, I don't know what became of him. I wasn't even aware that I still had the axe in my hand, leaving him defenseless. All I could do was hope he managed to escape. I caught up to Max, who was still crying and screaming as he ran. Grabbing his hand, I pulled him along, racing through the woods. Pale figures moved toward our camp, but for now we ran in the opposite direction. The white flyers on the trees blurred past us, each one reminding us of the creatures chasing us. Eventually, I forced us to stop, realizing in horror that we were lost. Max was gasping for air, unable to cry anymore. I clung to his hand, scanning the trees for any signs of the creatures. By some miracle, we didn't encounter any more of them. We stumbled into a clearing illuminated by the full moon. I had Max turn off the flashlight to save the batteries and avoid drawing attention. He sobbed quietly, and I let him. I couldn't blame him. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something white and instinctively raised the axe. It was another flyer stuck to a tree, something I'd mistaken for a monster. As I stared at it, writing appeared on the paper. Lost in the woods, being chased by monsters. Little brother with you. Your name is Cal. If that's you, call Lori. No, really, call me. The same phone number from before was written at the bottom. The message was unnervingly specific. Being chased by monsters was terrifying, but this felt disturbingly surreal. Then I remembered the phone in my jacket pocket. At this point, we had nothing to lose. I tried calling 911 first, but only static came through. With trembling fingers, I dialed the number from the flyer. After a single ring, a voice startled both of us. You kiddos need some help? I pulled Max into a protective hold when I heard the voice. Standing beside us was someone who hadn't been there a moment ago, holding a flip phone to their ear. Even in our terrifying situation, I didn't trust the stranger. They wore an oversized black coat with sleeves that nearly reached the ground and a collar that obscured much of their face. Judging by the voice and the visible part of their face, I couldn't determine their gender. If this was the Lori mentioned on the flyer, I guess they were a man. Lori was tall, taking just 2 steps to stand in front of us. Red hair covered one side of their face, concealing their right eye, while their left eye glowed an unnerving shade of red. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with a human. Can you help us? Max whimpered, clinging to me tightly. Of course, I can, Lori replied, their tone purring with amusement as if they enjoyed our fear. In the distance, I saw more of the creature's pale faces emerging from the darkness. They seemed cautious of Lori, but I knew it wouldn't be long before they came closer. My distrust evaporated as the creatures began to encircle us. Please save us from those Wendigos, I blurted out, desperate. I didn't know what these creatures were, so the name of the first monster that came to mind slipped out. They're not Wendigos, Lori said flatly. Does that even matter? I snapped, panicking as one of the pale faces moved closer, its dead eyes locked on us. It does, Lori said. If you ask me to save you from Wendigos, I'm only bound to save you from Wendigos. These things could devour you, and I wouldn't be able to lift a finger. Wording matters. Max trembled in my arms, his breathing rapid as he fixated on the creature now only a tree away. Its mouth hung open, drool dripping onto the forest floor. Please save us from these things trying to eat us, I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. Lori's red eyes gleamed as they leaned closer. What would you give me in exchange for saving you? They asked, their voice dripping with dark amusement. Anything, I shrieked as one of the creatures lunged toward us, its long, twisted fingers outstretched, ready to tear us apart. Fear consumed me, and I didn't think about what I had just promised. I only wanted us to survive. The creature's rancid breath was so close I could feel it against my face. Then suddenly it was gone. Lori moved so quickly that I didn't even see what happened. One moment, the creature was about to attack, and the next, its head was crushed against a tree, its limp body collapsing to the ground. "Hold my coat," Lori said, tossing it toward us. In shock, I let it fall to the ground as I stared at the dead creature. The others had retreated into the shadows, their glowing eyes still fixed on us, but now they jittered nervously, almost as if they were afraid. "You're a girl," I blurted out, my brain latching onto the first thought that surfaced. There were far more urgent matters at hand, but for some reason that question escaped my mouth. Lori smirked, her scarred lip pulling into a permanent crooked grin. She wore black shorts and a sports bra, her ribs painfully visible beneath her pale skin, though her muscular arms hinted at her immense strength. "Wrap the coat around yourselves," she said, her voice firm. "It'll hide your scent and protect you from their bites. I need to lure them to me, get them riled up so I can take them all down at once." Without waiting for permission, she grabbed my jacket sleeve and tore it off with one swift motion. I winced as she cut a deep gash into the palm of my hand, letting the blood soak into the fabric. She didn't apologize as she tied the bloodied sleeve around her forearm. Max watched, wide-eyed, too shaken to react. Lori strode into the middle of the clearing, her figure illuminated by the full moon. I wrapped Max and myself in her oversized coat, keeping him close as I peeked out to watch. The creatures began hissing, their dead eyes glowing with hunger as the scent of fresh blood filled the air. They were no longer afraid of Lori, driven instead by the overpowering urge to feed. One of the creatures darted toward her, its pale figure a blur in the moonlight. In an instant, Lori slammed it to the ground and twisted its head clean off. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. She was strong enough to handle the monsters that had taken my friends. Two more creatures lunged at her, their inhuman screeches chilling me to my core. One managed to slash her shoulder, but Lori didn't seem to notice. Instead, she grinned, almost as if she was enjoying the fight. In moments, I could no longer count the pale forms moving through the woods surrounding the clearing. That's when I realized the potential for disaster. Lori was strong, but the sheer number of creatures closing in was overwhelming. If more than 3 attacked at once, she would take hits before she could fend them off. My fear surged as 2 more creatures replaced everyone she had taken down. A sharp claw tore across her stomach, but instead of faltering, she began to laugh. A wild, unsettling laugh that grew louder with each wound she received. She hurled shredded creatures aside, her laughter escalating into a manic shriek. Beneath the coat, Max trembled, unable to see what I was witnessing, but Lori's laughter terrified him. He thought a new monster had appeared. I held him tightly, trying to stay calm. Lori was on our side. She had to be. We would survive the night. That was all that mattered. But then, something emerged from the forest that shattered my fragile hope. The new creature's arrival sent the others scattering, desperate to escape. The monster had a vaguely human shape but was grotesque beyond belief. Rows of human arms lined its sides. Twisting legs merged to form massive supports for its hulking body. Its head was a horrific collection of skulls and decayed faces. When it caught a creature, dead or alive, it revealed a gaping mouth lined with sharp teeth, devouring the prey whole. My stomach dropped as I watched this monstrosity launch itself at Lori. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face, and I felt my body freeze. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The creature bore down on Lori, forcing her to the ground under its immense weight. She strained to hold it off, her arms trembling, as the creature's many hands pinned her limbs and began tearing into her stomach. I couldn't look away, even as bile rose in my throat. Her screams filled the clearing as the monster ripped her apart, pulling out her insides with horrifying ease. As the creature's mouth opened to consume one of Lori's severed legs, her screaming stopped. Confused, I saw that she was smiling again, her twisted grin returning as though this was all part of her plan. Faintly, I heard her murmur, "Gotcha." Then her hair began to glow like embers, and a massive burst of flame erupted from her, shooting directly into the monster's gaping maw. The inferno was so intense that the creature's head disintegrated in seconds. The light was blinding, and the heat seared the air, burning away leaves and setting small fires along the edge of the clearing. I ducked beneath the coat, shielding Max and myself from the blazing heat. I don't know how long we stayed huddled under that coat. I whispered to Max, telling him everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure. The monsters were gone, but I couldn't rest. I needed to see what had happened to Lori, if anything remained of her. Reassuring Max once more, I stepped out of the coat, leaving him hidden. The air reeked of burnt flesh and decaying meat, making me gag. Small flames flickered here and there, remnants of the intense heat, though I hoped they would die out before starting a real fire. The monstrous body lay collapsed, its head melted away. Nearby, Lori's form was crumpled, half her body missing. Her remaining eyes stared at me, almost expectant, as if waiting. But that couldn't be possible. She couldn't still be alive, could she? "Little help here, Scout," her hoarse voice rasped, startling me. I rushed to her side, struggling not to vomit as I avoided looking at the gore that was once her torso. Instead, I focused on her face. "You need to do something for me," she said, cutting off my attempt to ask how she was. "Cut off my head. Please attach it to one of those creatures' bodies. Pick one without broken arms, or one you think is the most attractive," she added with a weak laugh that sounded more like a cough. I don't think I can," I stammered, overwhelmed by nausea and fear. "You said you'd do anything if I saved you," she reminded me, her grin unwavering even as her voice faded. With one final laugh, Lori stopped breathing. At the same moment, the remaining heat and small fires in the clearing were extinguished, leaving a heavy silence. She was right. I had promised. Wording mattered. I retrieved the axe I'd left with Max, making sure he was still hidden and hadn't seen the carnage around us. Dragging the first creature Lori had killed into the clearing, I tried to ignore the way its smashed head lolled. The real challenge came when I had to sever Lori's head. Every swing of the axe sent shudders through me, forcing me to stop repeatedly to dry heave. The sensation of the blade cutting through bone was something I'd never forget. Even in death, her smile lingered. Whether from her scar or her frozen muscles, I couldn't tell. Holding her severed head was a surreal, horrifying experience. Quickly, I placed it on the creature's neck and stepped back, wiping my hands on my jeans to rid myself of the sickening sensation. The transformation happened immediately. Lori's old body crumbled into ash, and the creature's form burst into flames before burning away to reveal her newly restored body. Her wounds were gone, and she sat up, rubbing her neck as though nothing had happened. To my horror, she was completely exposed. Even her clothes had vanished when her body burned away. Seeing her like this confirmed what I'd suspected. Despite her build and demeanor, she was unmistakably a woman. Flustered, I grabbed her coat and threw it over her as quickly as possible. I didn't want Max to see her like that after everything else he'd endured that night. Lori didn't seem embarrassed. Instead, she cackled at my red face, her grin as infuriating as ever. "Can we leave now, please?" I asked, cutting through Lori's laughter. "All right, fine. "Don't be so grumpy," she replied, her tone amused. "I doubt anything's going to attack you too after all this. But I'll still walk with you out of the woods. If you're scared, you can hold my hand, little ones." "No thanks," Max and I said in unison. Lori's smile faltered slightly, and for a moment, she looked offended by our rejection. "His legs are too short. Carry him," Lori ordered, nodding toward my brother. Max was so shaken I doubted he could walk far, and it would take forever to get out of the woods otherwise. Reluctantly, I hoisted him onto my back, wincing as my injured hand stung with each movement. I kept the axe in my free hand, unwilling to part with it. Lori reached out and placed her hand on Max's head. He slumped forward, suddenly limping on my back. I bristled, ready to snap at her, but she waved me off. "I just put the little one to sleep. He's seen enough tonight," she explained. "I can carry him if you want. In fact, if you're not so attached, I could take him off your hands entirely." I know how bratty little brothers can be. Exhausted as I was, I refused to let her mock me. At least I hoped she was only teasing. "Don't touch him," I said sharply. My voice carried more venom than I intended, and I immediately regretted it when her smile vanished. At that moment, Lori was more terrifying than any creature in the forest. "Oh, and how do you plan to stop me?" she asked, her tone dangerously low. "You both promised me anything if I saved you. I could collect on that at any time. I could take him right now or just parts of him. He has such lovely blue eyes, and I've been needing a replacement for my own." She reached toward Max as she spoke, her hand nearing him. Panic took over and I acted on instinct. Without thinking, I bit down on her hand as hard as I could. Her blood was searing hot, scalding my mouth and tongue, but I held on. The taste was vile, but I refused to let go. Lori laughed again, her voice light and amused, as she easily pulled her hand free. The bite mark vanished before my eyes, and her skin healed instantly. "We don't owe you anything," I spat, trying to rid my mouth of the foul taste. "I saved you. You were dead. You already got something from us." Her grin returned sharper and more menacing than ever. "You think I could die from something like that?" she said, mockery dripping from her words. "I would have been fine. I switched bodies for your sake. I would have healed on my own, but using a new body got you out of these woods faster. And do you think I'd only ask for one thing? You both agreed to anything. The wording is important. I can ask for anything from you until the day you die, even if you saved my life. That doesn't make us equal. That's the deal you made. Anything for your life." Her laughter echoed through the clearing, and the weight of my mistake crashed down on me. "That's not fair," I said, hating how my voice trembled. "Fair?" she repeated, sneering. "Fair is a human concept. What do you think you made a deal with? I'm not human, and fair is not what I do." Desperation overtook me. I couldn't let Lori hold this over Max for the rest of his life. I had to protect him. That's what older siblings are for. "I'll take his debt," I said suddenly. "I'll do anything for you. Anything." "You don't get him." Lori's red eye glinted as she studied me. "Oh? And how is that fair for me? You were talking about fairness. Why should I take an offer where I lose?" "Because fair is a human concept," I countered, my voice steadier than I expected. "You're not human. You shouldn't care about how fair the offer is." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, her smile softened into something resembling approval. She laughed, but it wasn't the harsh cackle from before. It was lighter, almost parental. "Fine, I'll take that unfair deal. You belong to me, but your little brother is spared. Now let's get out of these woods. Your human smell is making me hungry." Relief washed over me for the first time that night. Adjusting Max on my back, I followed Lori as she began walking away. The forest was still, and no creatures came for us during the trek back. Lori led us to the trail, her steps confident. Though I was exhausted from carrying Max, I didn't stop. When we finally emerged from the woods, I stood in the parking lot, staring at Ethan's car and wondering what to do next. Silent and overwhelmed, I felt on the verge of breaking down. "Give me the axe," Lori said, holding out her hand. "Huh?" I asked, dazed. I hadn't even realized I was still clutching it. Wordlessly, I handed it to her, glad to be rid of the weight. "Now, let me borrow your brother for a few seconds," she added. I took a step back, my exhaustion evaporating as fear surged again. She sighed, her tone irritated but patient. "3 people are dead. You humans will make a big deal of it. I've got a loose end of my own to handle. I can make someone confess to chopping up your friends with this axe. The police will be happy to close the case, and I get rid of that human. I don't do things for free, and you can't offer me anything more. This way, I clean up the mess and benefit myself." "You knew we were in danger," I said, my voice shaky. "Those flyers, you could have saved us sooner. Why didn't you?" "You didn't call me," Lori replied calmly. "I don't do things for free. I can't come unless asked. Helping humans isn't even my job. I do this for fun." Tears welled up in my eyes. I had a phone. If I just called Lori earlier, maybe everyone would still be alive. "No, it's not anyone's fault," she said, her tone oddly soft. "Like I told you, creatures like me don't play fair. It's not fair that one of your group was replaced and killed your friends. You didn't know the danger, so why would you think to call for help?" I wasn't sure if she was trying to comfort me. It didn't seem like her style, but her words gave me a small measure of solace. My friends were gone, but at least I understood there wasn't much we could have done to stop it. "I can alter your brother's memory," Lori continued. "He'll remember going into the woods with you to pee, getting lost, and coming back to find a crazy man who had killed your friends. It's not a great truth, but it's one he can live with, and kids are terrible liars. I can't have him talking about monsters." Though I didn't fully trust her, I knew it was the right choice for Max. A therapist could help him process a story about an axe murderer, but no one would believe tales of pale forest creatures. Lori waved her hand over Max's forehead, and just like that, his memory was rewritten. "Why don't you change mine too?" I asked. "I don't think you want me to know about strange creatures either." My words earned me a sharp kick to the shin. "I don't do things for free," she snapped. "Your brother's memory changed because of the trauma. Don't mistake that for a freebie. And I can't change yours. You made a deal with me." Lori leaned closer, her red eye glinting. "Think of it this way. Let's say I saved you in exchange for a nice dinner. If I erased your memory, I could convince you that you still owe me. Wording matters. If you make a deal with a creature, your memory is protected. Some don't care about those rules, but believe it or not, you got a good deal with me." The idea of Lori being better than other monsters was unsettling, but she wasn't wrong. We had survived. "Why did you save us?" I asked hesitantly. She had already said helping humans wasn't her job. She'd been hurt, ripped apart even. What could she possibly gain? Lori hesitated, her gaze shifting as though debating whether to answer. Finally, she huffed and muttered, "I have a soft spot for kids." The admission seemed to embarrass her, and before I could respond, she changed the subject. She told me to keep her number, though she left me with a grim warning. Once someone encounters a supernatural creature, they almost always meet their end at the hands of one, even if they survive the first time. Her prediction proved true. A man later confessed to killing Ethan, Laura, and Dylan. The authorities found traces of their blood but no bodies. I couldn't shake the fear that my friends had become part of the amalgamation Lori destroyed or turned into those pale creatures still lurking in the woods. I stayed in my small town. Despite everything, I became a volunteer ranger, helping search for lost people. Sometimes I found them, sometimes I didn't. Max turned out better than I expected. He's still in therapy, but he started dating, and seeing him try to lead a normal life makes me happy. That's all I ever wanted for him. I tried to convince myself that everything that happened was just a nightmare, something my mind conjured to cope with. I've never encountered anything strange since, not even in those woods. I've heard stories, but none as horrific as my own experience. I almost settled into a routine until Lori came to collect on her deal. She told me to meet her at a motel at 8 p.m. I didn't ask why. I don't think I'll be seen again after tonight. I don't know why I'm writing this. Most people will think it's fiction or the ramblings of someone who's lost their mind. Still, I arrived hours early to jot everything down in this old-school notebook. If anyone finds this, I want to warn them, don't make deals with monsters. If it had just been me that night, I would have let myself be eaten. But Max made it out, and for that, I'll pay whatever the cost is. I've learned there are far worse things than death. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you can make a deal with a monster, take a moment. Think carefully. You don't want to be in debt to these creatures. And if you do end up indebted, remember, they don't play fair and wording is everything. That was the last entry in the journal. I had to leave the next morning and couldn't investigate further. Even now, I'm rushing to write down what I read a year ago. My job keeps me busy. I've recently heard another story about Lori. This time, she was with a different creature, not doing much but observing. Perhaps I'll uncover more tales about her. For now, I'll continue listening to the stories that find their way to me and documenting the best ones.